quite clearly the Whitlam government was paying greater attention to issues of different ethnic communities. I'm not sure that that was advancing the cause of multiculturalism as I understood it, because so many things about the Whitlam government were, and for those who look at it closely, remain very divisive. There were a lot of people who were frightened of Gough Whitlam and frightened of the government, and especially people, I think, who'd come from Eastern Europe or from the Baltic states and whatever. In 1974 and 75, they thought the country was disintegrating. And I met a number of people who, in fact, decided to leave Australia because they said, we've seen this sort of thing happening before and we're not going to sit around and wait for it to happen again. And 1975 was a strange year because it was the first year since Arthur Calwell began the migration program when more people left Australia than came to Australia, which is an interesting commentary on that year. But, you know, the political events of 1975, in my view, submerged nearly every other issue. They submerged the media, the Loans Affair, the problems with ministers, and ultimately the supply crisis itself. So what was done, I think, was really to emphasise issues of concern to ethnic communities, but without really putting this in a multicultural context, without showing how this related to the needs of Australia or Australia's broader unity.
How did you perceive it as being divisive? Could you talk about that a bit more?
Well, so many of the things that Mr. Whitlam was doing were divisive. I mean, the very fact that the budget in 1973 increased by 46% from one year to the next, there were a lot of people just saying, you know, this man is wasting money. Therefore, every area of new or increased expenditure came under a great deal of criticism and a great deal of resentment from many people because they thought it was destroying the economy and damaging our competitive position and leading to more unemployment. And in that background, it wasn't possible to look at the larger objectives that the government may have had in mind. It all got submerged in the issues of irresponsibility, financial waste, and whatever. Because no government can increase expenditure by that much from one year to the next and do it responsibly. And the consequence was that nearly every area of increased expenditure came in for a great deal of criticism.
What do you see was Mr. Grasby's role during those years?
The government and Mr. Grasby himself were certainly significantly instrumental in persuading, I think, a number of people in ethnic communities that they were more concerned about ethnic issues than the Liberal Party had been. But I suppose from our perspective, we would say that at times in doing that, they were exploiting issues politically which shouldn't have become political issues.
And would you consider the issues to do with the migrant communities one of those issues that they were exploiting?
Well, I mean, this was Mr. Grasby's area of responsibility, wasn't it? He was Minister for Immigration and Ethnic Affairs also. And he was a very active publicist minister. I think he did a number of things that migrant communities liked, but at the same time, in terms of the broader community, it was very difficult to get support or praise for what was being done because of the financial and economic background of the government's policies, which really led to the disintegration of the government and to the supply crisis in 1975. And it was it's really impossible, I think, unless you're very intimately involved, I suppose, with migrant or ethnic programs, or unless you're a strong Labour supporter, to look at whatever the Whitlam government was doing out of context of the broader impact of what was happening to Australia.
During this period, 1972 to 75, at one stage you became Shadow Minister for Immigration. And there was a review of all portfolios, including the immigration portfolio. What changes were you able to make during, or suggest during that time, or thought that you had to make as a Liberal Party?
Well, I was only Shadow Minister for Immigration for a relatively short time, and then I was made Shadow Minister for Labour and Industrial Relations. And I don't think, it was really a very, very short period indeed. And the main contribution that I made in that area was really as Prime Minister, when a number of things were set in train, which I think altered the face of the multicultural debate throughout Australia.
When you did become PM in 75, what was your vision for Australia in regards to multiculturalism?
Well, multiculturalism, I don't think, had been enunciated very much by 1975. It was probably in the process of establishing the Galway Inquiry or implementing the Galway Inquiry that the concept and the philosophy of multiculturalism came to be enunciated in an appropriate sense. And it's worth noting that what we were trying to do was opposed by the Labour Party in the Senate. A number of issues relating to multiculturalism were held up, threatened, criticised, not quite on racist grounds, but certainly on Anglo-Saxon grounds, if there's a difference. Senator Button was amongst the foremost in expressing reservations about a number of aspects of the government's programs. And I suppose these really fell into two areas, the programs flowing out of the Galway Inquiry and the debates and the arguments that occurred over SBS television and whatever. But for myself, the broad background to the concept of multiculturalism was always designed to make all Australians, no matter what their background, feel that they belonged, that other people accepted that they belonged, that they didn't need to keep looking over their shoulder to when somebody was going to, shout at them, where do you come from, or whatever. And certainly up to the beginning of the Second War, Australia was a pretty narrow Anglo-Saxon community, a very strong Irish element, but there was also very strong and deeply held differences between Roman Catholics and Protestant religions. A division that arose out of the original problems with Ireland, some arguments which involved Archbishop Mannix, but arguments which were promoted by Prime Minister Billy Hughes during the war over conscription debates. And he turned those debates into anti-Irish, anti-Catholic debates in a most irresponsible and destructive way. And I think Archbishop Mannix's role in all of that was a responsible, disciplined one, and a decent one. But the role of the Prime Minister certainly was not. But that, that's another story. But so the strands in Australia, or the important historic trends, were Anglo-Saxon British, and with a minority, a strong Irish streak, which I suppose gave a particular character to Australia. But if you didn't belong in those communities in the years up to the war, and for some time after the war, to be regarded as a real Australian, you had to either be Anglo-Saxon or Irish or whatever, or if not, pretend to be. Now, for a lot of people, that's a bit difficult, and a lot of people didn't want to anyway. So the purpose of, and the philosophy of multiculturalism, in my view, was always to make sure that that strand within the Australian community came to understand that it's not the only strand, that people from different historic and ethnic backgrounds should be respected for what they had been, what they were in Australia, that the history and culture of their countries should be respected as we respected the history and culture of Britain and whatever. And that in this way, the Australian community would become broader and deeper, more responsible, and also much more tolerant. The idea of SBS was not to run a television program for ethnic communities, but to run programs which all Australians would want to see and hear so that we could all learn a bit more about each other. We'd originally tried to get the ABC to do it. They were just not interested and came in with an offer late in the day, but I'd certainly made up my mind by that time that if we went the ABC route, it would never get a fair go or a fair hearing, and I think that the history of SBS has been remarkably successful. But the idea of multiculturalism, in my mind, is one that draws a community together, the whole community, and therefore adds to the unity and strength of Australia as a whole. Unfortunately, and very much because of these were the sorts of arguments that were promoted by senators in the early days of multiculturalism in the latter part of the 1970s, there are still people who believe that multiculturalism is designed to promote special programs for Greeks or Italians or Vietnamese or whatever for their advantage without any relationship to the rest of Australia. And really for those people making Greece or Italy or Vietnam more important than Australia. But it was never that. If British history is taught, that doesn't make British history more important than Australian history. If Vietnamese history is taught, it shouldn't make Vietnam more important than Australian history. And I think the whole idea was that people should be able to respect or love the history and culture of their land of origin, and if they wanted to. And that did not in any way diminish the primacy of the place which they accorded their new country, Australia, or the love or affection that they had for Australia. Indeed, if Australians generally had respect for the source countries from whom people have come, I would have thought then that people who become Australians from those places are going to have a greater affection, a greater regard for their new country than if it was a country that despised the origin of others. And, you know, if you went back to the 1930s, it would not really be too strong for quite a lot of people to say that people who came from other places, that their origins were despised. It'd be too strong for some, tolerated or whatever, but certainly not given the same place, or not given a place on an honour roll, for example. So multiculturalism, as I understand it, is not something which is separatist, something which is unifying, was its objective and purpose, and I think by and large it succeeded. But even in more recent times, with the problems between the Greeks and the Macedonians, you see some people saying that's multiculturalism, that's failed, when really it's, we wouldn't have these issues here if there were no Greeks here and no Macedonians here. But I think it's an open question as to who started to make this a political issue.
Could you just elaborate, when you assumed government, there was, if I can put it this way, an ideal, the aim of having small government, a reduction in, or a review of different portfolios.
Yeah.
In the midst of all this reduction in spending, you have the Garbley report and just a massive allocation of funds. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, you see, we did reduce spending and reduced it very significantly. We reduced the number of Commonwealth public servants and reduced the numbers very considerably. But a government has always got to be able to establish priorities. And it's not a question of saying we're cutting expenditure, you take 2% or 5% off everything. You have a capacity to establish priorities to determine, and that sets the values by which a government or a people will be judged. And because we thought there were deficiencies in this area, we were prepared to face up to the fact that some funds would need to be spent in the cause of multiculturalism. So again, it is just demonstrating a capacity to determine priorities.
At that time, who was Petro Giorgio, am I right?
Yes.
Was an advisor.
Yes, yeah.
Who else was important in your regards in you developing thinking about multiculturalism?
Oh, well, Petro was in part. I don't think I needed very much persuading in any aspects of it, because my own sympathies were very clear. Frank Galwally from the Galwally Report was obviously influential. But when you're talking about specific issues, you've got your objectives, you start to talk about SBS or other specific programs, then the debates come to the fore. I don't know that there's any particular or specific person. There are a few people in migrant communities that I got to know either, I can't recall now, it was when I was in charge of immigration or in charge of labour industrial relations, and I'd seen what they were doing on the ground and some of the problems that they had to face. George Papadopoulos in Melbourne was one of those. And that underlined for me, I think, that a number of people in ethnic communities did have problems in the Australian community that those of us with an Anglo-Saxon background had always been here did not have, and that the government maybe should be doing something about it or helping communities do something about it. So that, there was probably a fairly broad educative process so far as I was concerned.
George Papadopoulos actually related a story where you went and sat in the reception area, the front desk of the Australian Greek Welfare for a number of hours. And there, I guess you gained some sort of perception of the needs of the community.
The sorts of things that concern them.
One of the things that your government also did when it came into power was to actually reverse the Labor's decision, and you reformed the Department of Immigration. Can you talk about the reasoning, the thinking behind that?
Well, for a number of reasons. I'm not one of those that believe that migration should be chopped and changed as a result of hopefully temporary economic problems. I'm quite sure if migration was cut out, unemployment in Australia would rise. I haven't got the slightest doubt about that. And if you wanted to increase jobs, you would increase migration, because people who come here all want to achieve something. They're going to want to buy a home, they're going to want to have a home built, they're going to want to be able to afford a motor car, and they'll find ways of earning a dollar, and they'll contribute and they'll build. And if a country is growing in population, firms think the marketplace is going to go on growing, and that gives them greater encouragement to invest and to do new things. Now you start to unwind any significant or important element in the growth or development process. You unwind a lot of other things. And the equivocation about migration, should it be cut back, should it be increased? We've got unemployment, therefore it must be reduced. All these sorts of comments, I think, create greater uncertainty. And in my view, having a clear department responsible for these issues was making some kind of a statement of belief about the future of Australia and where we're going. I helped found the Australian Conservation Foundation before it was a trendy issue, before you would find any editorial being written in any newspaper, because they just weren't concerned. They couldn't have cared less. In the early 60s, with people like Max Day from CSIRO and Francis Ratcliffe, who wrote a book called Flying Fox and Drifting Sand, would have been one of Australia's first and most noted naturalists. And the ACF was founded on pretty solid lines, and I was a member of Parliament, and I got Harold Holt to grant a tax deductibility. I sometimes wish it hadn't when I see the things it's supported and the political causes it's advocated as opposed to environmental causes in recent times. You know, I'm just making a point, I think, that if you have a concern for certain issues, you've got to act in a way that underlines that concern. And the environmentalists who say that we've got enough people, we can't afford any more, the environment's going to be damaged. I just don't agree or accept that at all. And I made the point about my role at Conservation Foundation just to make the links of my origins as an environmentalist. But it's ridiculous to say that Australia, with the size country we've got, and only 18 million people, is overcrowded, overpopulated. There might be parts of Australia that are starting to be overcrowded and overpopulated, but that's not Australia. It might be just an area on the eastern seaboard or whatever. And I always I say hand because I don't see it shared by anyone in the political process today. I'm in Australia growing in strength and numbers, 20, 25, 30 million people within a foreseeable time frame, and having therefore greater influence, greater capacity for good, not only within Australia but within the region of which we as a country live. And certainly we'd be more respected throughout Asia if that dynamic in the development process was still part of our philosophy. That dynamic has run down in the last 8 or 10 years because of economic difficulties that people have not been able to handle. But in my term, I believe the dynamic for development was important. And having a separate Department for Immigration was making some sort of statement to Australia's ethnic communities, and if you like, to the world at large, about where the government stood on some of those issues.
Can we come on to the Galway Committee itself?
Mm.
Can you talk a little about how the people that were selected and why?
No, I can't at this stage. I haven't got the list of their names in front of me.
Frank Galway.
Well, Frank Galway, I mean, a number of people were proposed, and he came with strong credentials for the job. It wasn't the easiest appointment to get accepted through my own cabinet because Frank had fairly staunch Labour origins, which some people didn't want to forget. But he had been one of those who'd strongly supported me through 1975 and whatever. And I thought that he had the credentials for this kind of job. And the report that he prepared, I believe, vindicates that judgment absolutely. It was a good report, and it was implemented.
He actually related the story to us that you had asked him to assist in the Liberal Party's process, and he put the condition to you that only if you do more for migrants in the community.
Well, this was one of the things that he was certainly always interested in. Maybe he did. I'm just,
No, we thought
it's nearly 20 years ago.
Yes.
If he said he did, he did.
What was your vision for the report? What were you hoping could be achieved by it?
Well, what I want achieved, is, I think in many ways has been, and for a very large number of people, but maybe not for everyone at all the time, for all of Australia's communities, a total sense of belonging. That no matter what their origin, what their background, once they're Australian, they're accepted as Australian for what they themselves are. And that's it. They don't have to, look over their shoulder to wonder what somebody's going to shout at them. They don't have to feel apart and different or separate because they speak with a different accent or because their physical appearance isn't a typical Anglo-Saxon physical appearance. And I think that in large measure has been achieved in Australia. I mean, there are always going to be areas for improvement.
Can you discuss a little about your personal role and Petro Georgiou's role in the report and the final recommendations?
Well, there was the report was left very much to Frank and the committee. And then when it came forward, if I recollect, it went to a interdepartmental committee for implementation, and a series of recommendations which really embraced the report pretty well in its entirety came forward, and the government accepted that. Due process was observed. Other departments and ministers were given an opportunity to have their input into what was done. But it was one of those areas where you're really faced with the facts and the circumstances, the arguments are beyond refute. You couldn't deny the need or deny the appropriateness of conducting such policies or implementing such policies for the benefit of Australia as a whole. When one of the arguments that you're continually up against in this area from those Australians who don't really or adequately understand what it's all about is that you don't have these sorts of programs for people of English background. Why should you have them for people of another background? But that's not the point. It's a question of need and appropriateness and what you're trying to achieve. And when you set all that down in clear terms, building overall one community out of a great many disparate communities from different places, different origins, and doing so in a way that is cohesive, united, and builds a stronger and more unified Australia. And I think the programs have been, very significantly successful in all of that. In any area of human relationships, it's always possible to point to deficiencies and say, we need to do better there. But compared to 15 or 20 years ago, I think remarkable progress has been made.
Petro also suggested that we ask you about the difficulties that you did face in getting the report through Cabinet, because it was quite innovative. I imagine that there may have been some resistance. Are you able to talk about that?
Well, there was some resistance, there was some reluctance, but I'd won a couple of elections with reasonable majorities, and I suppose quite a number of ministers would have been reluctant, but they didn't argue all that strongly against the elements of the report, for the reasons which I've spoken about, but probably overwhelmingly, because most of them recognised, even if they instinctively, or some of them didn't like it, they recognised that on a straight, logical, rational argument, it was very hard to come down against the policies. They were appropriate, they were just. Their objective was to build a better and a more unified society. Now, it's very difficult to sustain an argument. The old argument, one of the few arguments that you can use, we don't do this for people of Anglo-Saxon origin, why should we do it for people of any other origin? We can't make Italian history more important than English history. But these arguments are not sustainable when you analyse them. And so the arguments against the programs were really the remnants of the kind of Anglo-Saxon argument that you would have got before 1939. And in those days, of course, the economic rationalists weren't game to stick their heads up. They would have another argument, just, it's a government intrusion in the marketplace and we shouldn't be doing anything. Well, that's even more irrational.
It's interesting given today's climate, I think. That argument.
Well, when I became leader of the Liberal Party, one of today's Member of Parliaments wanted to have lunch with me because he thought I was too far to the right for the Liberal Party. And the other day I said to him, you remember that lunch? He said, yes. He obviously knew what was coming. I said, well, my basic attitudes to people in society and the role of government have not changed. But you've jumped 1,000 miles to the right of me. And he has. I mean, the marketplace fixes some things, but without government guidelines or rules, the marketplace is a very cool arbiter of man's destiny. It really is. And the last 200 years of capitalism have been spent civilizing the marketplace, if you like. And we've done not a bad job. Now, it really seems odd that in the Anglo-Saxon world in particular, because it's not only an Australian disease, and an Australian disease put into place principally by a Labor government, which is the oddest thing of all, although the Liberal Party have said they'd go further, but the Labor Party have already gone in some respects too far. But in Britain and Canada and other places. And a lot of the impact of it is to undo the civilizing, humanizing influences on the role of capitalism in the marketplace that we had seen and put in place since the beginning of this century, and 1960, 1970. It's really a very odd phenomenon.
So the jargon now is about cultural productivity.
Well, it's all trying to measure things in those terms, and it's ludicrous. It really is. And that's why, you asked the question how we found money for the Galbally report when we're cutting expenditure. There were significant shifts within our priorities. And you can't say that your only objective is to cut expenditure. You still have to maintain objectives of equity, of social justice. And maybe you can't meet them as well as you would like if funds were unlimited, but funds are never unlimited for governments. But that doesn't mean to say that, in periods of financial restraint, you put equity and social justice aside and say, we'll come back to that in the next century.
You've mentioned a couple of times now SBS, and we'd like to talk a bit more about that, and also about the Australian Institute for Multicultural Affairs, which also came out of the Galbally report. What was it set up to do, and what do you think its successes were?
I think it was a useful instrumentality, but it was designed to study multicultural issues. It was designed to bring reason and coherence into debates which might otherwise be confused and emotional. It was intended to I suppose give a solid and, to the extent that you can, a factual basis for many of the debates on multicultural issues. I think it was broadly succeeding, but it was a Fraser initiative. I think there were still people in the Labor Party who wanted to get rid of Fraser initiatives simply because they had been Fraser initiatives. But I also think it was a bit of a hangover of that Senate attitude, which had been exhibited by a number of members of the Labor Party, who were as much part of the old Anglo-Saxon tradition as anyone else in Australia. These latent feelings of objection or resentment to multicultural policies pop up in the strange places where you don't expect to see them. And the Labour Party is no more immune from those feelings than the Liberal Party is. In many ways, the Labour Party has been better at moving into multicultural Australia because they've got more Labour branches, more members in parts of Australia where Australia's newest communities live. And the Liberal Party has been very backward, bad, a very significant failure. You do find people with all sorts of backgrounds in Liberal branches, but there hasn't been a positive effort to go and involve the communities in Liberal Party politics, as I think there has been, at least sporadically, by the Labour Party. But you do find that the uneasiness can still, I don't think it can ever again be a force that reverses the main thrust of policies that have been put in place since the middle 70s. I don't think that can happen. But it occurs from time to time. And I think the perceived need to cut expenditure, coupled with the fact that, as I said, it was a Fraser initiative, and some latent elements of wondering whether these specific programs were wise or sensible. All these things combined to have its head chopped off.
Whose idea was that?
Look, it's very difficult for me to recall specifically whose idea it was, because there are so many discussions around that time about the future of multicultural policy, how to give effect to it in a sensible, rational, reasoned. Economic rationalists have almost made rational an inappropriate word, in a reasoned way. And the idea of the Institute certainly came out of discussions at this time and discussions in relation to the Galbraith report. But whose idea it was specifically, I don't think I could recall at this point.
What about SBS? Because it was also an initiative of the Galbraith report.
Yes. Well, the objection to the SBS as much as anything was that it should be the ABC. But the ABC had this overall responsibility within its charter and had never given effect to it. And again, it's nonsense to say they didn't have the money, because it's a question of their priorities. If they'd given it any kind of priority, they could have shoved some money in the direction of that kind of programming. But they never had, except on the rarest of occasions. And I think the chairman of the ABC came to us with a latter-day bid and proposal that they should handle it all. But it was a very half-hearted affair, and by that time anyway, the government, I think, had decided, and I'd certainly decided, that the ABC would never give justice to the objectives. And the very fact that the sorts of opposition to multiculturalism had arisen in different parts of the Australian community and in parts of the Liberal Party in the Parliament made me all the more determined that we were going to create structures that could not have their heads chopped off or that could not just be sort of pushed into a corner and starved. And that really meant that you had to establish a separate organisation. And that, of course, is what we did. And I think also it's been a singular success. As you would well know, it's not, we can't get SBS here, or we could if we spent $2,000 on a dish. But I wish we could. It has the best news service in the country. And it runs a number of other programs which I think are enjoyable or informative or both. And it fills a need that, nobody paid any attention to.
Certainly unique in the world.
Yes.
Which in itself is quite remarkable, I think.
It's interesting, AIMA and SBS is the authorities that would basically institute multiculturalism?
I think in many ways that's so. I felt that you needed some institutional structures to make sure that the country didn't fall back into older ways. Well, SBS has survived, but the Institute hasn't. But if you want a job done, it's not a bad way to do it, is to establish something by statute, then give it to a group of responsible people and say, they go to it.
In your, I was flicking through some papers the other day and came across a pamphlet that had the text for your inaugural speech to AMA in November 1981. And in that you made the comment that ethnic communities have been very successful in achieving gains for themselves in terms of changing attitudes in the media and educators, etc., etc. Could you actually talk a bit about what you perceive ethnic communities' relationships were to the government, to your government? And given that you've already mentioned the Liberal Party itself is not very successful in going out and searching out those people for themselves, that comment would suggest that you think that they have had some involvement with the government and have been influential in policy.
Well, I think ethnic communities have been influential. I think my own contacts and relationships with different ethnic groups was quite close. I certainly regard it as a constructive relationship. And their views were considered when government policy was being formulated. And they had access to my ministers, they had access to me. People knew that they expressed views that had to be taken into account. Otherwise, policies might be incomplete or inadequate in the implementation. Now, this is a very, very far cry from even 10 or 15 years earlier, when none of that would have happened. It really is a dramatic change. Now, they wouldn't have. If you went back, I suppose, to 1970, I doubt if ethnic communities would have been recognised by the media, would they? If somebody came along and said, I'm chairman or president of this ethnic group, journalists and editors would have, yawned? It's been a dramatic change in Australian attitudes. It really has. And the role of ethnic communities, as well as the role of governments at different times, have been significantly responsible in this. And, one of the things which up to quite recent times has been, I think, remarkably successful, and that's the attempts by ethnic community leaders to make sure that arguments from other parts of the world don't get brought into Australia. You take all the problems of Yugoslavia and Bosnia, how easy it would have been for that to become inflamed in this country. Now, sure, all right, there are some problems in relation to the Macedonians and Greeks, but I hope the leaders of both groups will prevail and that they recognise that whatever the mistakes they might believe governments have made or have not made, those sorts of divisions really have no place in the kind of Australia we're trying to build. And that if they want to influence government policy, really need to find ways of doing it that don't run the risk of cementing some of those divisions within different groups in Australia.
How do you explain the fact that Australia has achieved the phenomenon, I guess, that every time there is a particular division between communities, there's not a war that breaks out in comparison to other countries? I think it's quite an achievement. Why is that happening?
Well, for a long while, one of the contributory elements, and this was certainly true up to the end of my time, was the fact that politicians believe that certain issues should not be made a matter of party politics. Now, immigration was one of those issues. Ethnic issues, in a sense, was largely one of those issues. I mean, there's a difference between saying that a government is not paying attention to ethnic community issues. I'm sure that's a legitimate matter for debate. But matters that can be argumentative or divisive between communities or within a community are matters of a different kind. And so I think there'd been a restraint on the part of Australia's politicians for a very long while. And one of the reasons for that restraint also was because there had been a pretty broad agreement between Labor and the Liberal Party on the need for an effective and vigorous migration program. And none of us wanted to do anything to upset that or diminish public acceptance of it. Now, since the debates about migration, public acceptance of a continuing program, I suspect, is much less than it used to be, partly because nobody, or those in favour of a strong and vigorous program, don't really seem to speak out very much. You know, I hope there's still some who have those sorts of beliefs. But if they do, they've not been very vocal. But I think, really, you've just got to say that the political process has contributed to the success of Australia's policies, but the responsibility of community leaders has played an equal part in making sure that some of the problems from other parts of the world don't find their way into Australia.
It's interesting when you mentioned when you were talking about immigration debates, were you referring to the so-called blame debates of the early 80s? Because I was wondering about, you were saying that there was no speaker out for a dynamic immigration program, and it seems that our source of people is mainly Asia, and that's been somewhat difficult. It appears that that's somewhat more difficult for people to accept than...
Well, it might be in part more difficult, but see, Australia used to run an active policy throughout Europe and many parts of the world in trying to attract people to come here. We don't do that anymore. We used to have an assisted passage scheme. We don't do that anymore. If you wanted to get migrants from the former Yugoslavia today, I suspect it might be very easy. If you wanted to get migrants from a number of countries in Eastern Europe or the Soviet Union, I don't think it would be very difficult. There would be economic refugees from these places just as much as there would be economic refugees, or there were, from Europe in the early years after the war. Well, in the early years after the war, it's political and economic, obviously. But the political died out after a while. And in the Soviet Union or former Soviet Union, whether it's political refugees or economic refugees. But we're not actively seeking migrants in the way which we were. We don't have that same sense of nation building that we did 30, 40, I think it was still alive 20 years ago. I mean, Geoffrey Blaney is right to a point. Political leaders shouldn't push a migration process so hard or so fast that you break community tolerance. That seemed to me to be the point that he's making. But because he was making that point, it also made it possible for a lot of other people to come on and say, in some respects, it's gone beyond that point already. And Geoffrey Blaney's involvement gave credibility, I suppose, to those issues. I don't think it had reached that sort of point at all, because maybe I've got a longer memory than some. And in the 50s, you would have found the same sort of arguments being made against Greek migration or Italian migration. And funnily enough, I think it was sometimes Greeks or Italians who were making the point about Asian immigration, without being aware that it was Anglo-Saxon Australians who had made the very same point about Greek migration in the 1950s. So, you know, these things go in waves and cycles a little bit. And it often depends on how the issue is managed, how the debate is handled, and the leadership. I mean, where really do you see, I mean, it's all very well to say we've got to become part of Asia and we get closer to Asia. Ever since the Colombo Plan and Dick Casey, who was the first foreign minister to parade through the capitals of Asia and established originally Australia's very good relationship with Asia, or the Japanese Trade Treaty, which we signed in 1955-56 with Japan, only 3 or 4 years after the peace treaty had been signed. That was an act of real political courage and of political risk at the time, but essential, because we knew Britain was going to join the community even though they swore on the Bible they weren't. We knew better than they did what they were going to do, and we were right. But you've got... So governments for decades have been recognising that we've got to become closer to Asia. But then it's... that in itself is not enough for a vision for Australia. I would love to see a current day politician get up and say he wants to see an Australia of 30, 40 million people having a more powerful influence in our regional and world affairs, wanting us to have a more powerful influence because he believes from the intrinsic nature of the Australian community that it will be a force for good and for peace and for stability. Now, nobody has that sort of vision. They're terrified of the environmentalists who will say we're going to be overpopulated. I think that's ridiculous. I mean, you manage an environment. You don't let the environment manage you. And with the techniques and knowledge that we have, we can manage the environment and do it very effectively. Again, it's a question of priorities and whatever. So, I'm not sure where that question began, actually.
I'm just sitting here trying to imagine Australia twice the size. I must admit it's something that I've never conceived of, definitely not in my lifetime. I already think there's traffic.
But it's already it's 2.5 times the size that it was when I left school.
See, that's absolutely phenomenal that our population has gone
7 million to 18.
It was a very ambitious, I think, program. I think they've managed it very well.
Yes, but we've been and the economic hardship has only started to seep into Australia as that program wound down. Government spent all their money on recurrent account and not on capital nation building. We think we can absorb all our resources today and use them all ourselves and spend all the money in ice cream parlours and not have to put anything aside for building a better country.
It's a very interesting point you made, the winding down of the immigration program.
It's part of winding down expectations about what Australia can be.
So it seems to me that what you're actually speaking of is your vision of the future.
No, it is.
A possible future
Mm.
for Australia. Can I just, before we leap off into beyond 2000, can I take us back to after AMA had its head chopped off, in your words, OMA came up in its place, which was the institutional expression of the government at the time.
What came up?
Sorry, the Office of Multicultural Affairs.
Oh, attached to the PM's.
Yes.
Office, yeah.
Would you like to care to comment on that as a replacement for AMA?
Well, I don't know what the Office of Multicultural Affairs has done. You see, the Institute had the capacity for independent reports and statements. It could hold functions and all the rest, and there could be public occasions. I always regarded the Office of Multicultural Affairs, I regarded that as a sop. We're killing something that's useful, but we'll pretend it's still existing. And it'll disappear a bit later anyway. Unless people can build up enough pressure to get the Institute reinstated.
when the Galway Committee was doing its consulting with the community as such, they reported to who, which department or which office?
I'd have to check my memory, but I thought they would either be reporting to the minister or to me.
Galway says the same. We're trying to work out who it was, whether it was one or the other, or indeed not both.
Have you got a copy of the report?
Yes, back at
It doesn't.
It's presented to you, I think.
It's actually presented to Mr. McKellar, but Fred Galway actually said that he was had contact with both yourself and Petra.
Oh, he did. There's no doubt about that. He had contact with both of us, and whoever it was specifically to, I regarded as a report to and for the government as a whole.
Can you talk more about Petra's role in the whole agenda of multiculturalism during your government? It seems to have played it.
Well, it was very useful, I think, having somebody with Petra's background on my own staff. He could, he was born out here, but with his own family background, he could still relate to the issues much more readily than I ever could, for example, or other people in my office. And therefore, he was a very useful link man to the Galway inquiry, to Frank, and also at times to other people in the communities. It was an invaluable role as far as I was concerned.
Just to end, in your view, how do you believe the succeeding Labor governments have handled multiculturalism? I think we sort of touched on it a bit here now.
Well, apart from the Institute, which I regret, but to be non-partisan, I've got to admit that the Liberal Party would also have done the same thing, because in so many of the policies of the 1980s, the Liberal criticism of Labor is that you're not doing enough of what you're doing, that you should go further. And so in those sorts of areas, the Liberal knife would probably have cut deeper. I hope the party has learned some lessons, and that when it does enunciate policies again, it's going to be less of the right and more pragmatic and sensible. But I suppose I don't read everything as closely as I should, but I'm not really aware that the Labor Party has made all that much change, that they've changed things significantly. They provide money through their budgets, of course. But I think by the time the Hawke government and certainly the Keating government came into being, the policies were very much set. Pattern of behaviour was set. SBS was in place. Multicultural programs were there. And there's been no revolution in that area, has there? Has there been any major change?
No.
I think, maybe there should have been more change than there has.
There was a threat, of course, with the 86 budget, where it was held up that SBS may be amalgamated with the ABC, and they were also planning to cut spending to English as a second language classes. And then I think in some way galvanised the ethnic communities in a way that they hadn't had to before.
Well, it's good to see that some group can be galvanised, because there are so many groups in Australia that I think seem to suffer enormous provocation and still stay lethargic in their living rooms. And, their leaders, or organisational leaders, just seem to me have become part of the government bureaucracy with no independent capacity for action or criticism. I think that's a great pity.
Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I would include all farm organisations in that group, every one of them. I think farmers believe politically they're not represented. Small businesses, I think, believe they're not represented. farmers are just a small business after all. It's probably mostly in the sort of commercial arena. But I think Australia would be very much better off if small business leaders and farm leaders and exporting groups thumped the tub a good deal harder. I think the ACTU has been castrated. I mean, they have sat by and watched tens of thousands of jobs disappearing. In my time, 1 car in 5 was imported, and now 1 out of 2 is imported. Now that's fine if you live in an open marketplace, but somehow you've got to pay for that motor car. The automotive trade deficit in the last 8 years has doubled from $3 to over $6 billion. The manufacturing trade deficit since the 70s has gone from $2 billion a year average over succeeding several years to $34 billion a year. Is it any wonder that our external debt goes on rising and is going to go on rising, and nobody has a policy in place to do something about it? That's a lot of money around your necks, around mine and everyone else's. And it's reasonably important.
Can I just conclude? One of the key themes that we are exploring in this research project is the influence and the impact of ethnic communities. Can you mention perhaps who, if you do recall any names who you think were critical in influencing government, and perhaps some examples where they actually influenced the way of government thinking or programs or SBS perhaps?
Oh gosh, there are a number of people that I've known that would have been influential. We mentioned only 1 or 2 of them. George Papadopoulos would have been one. Frank's not from ethnic communities, but he certainly would have been. There are members of the Ethnic Communities Council in New South Wales at different times that would certainly have had an influence on government policies. I'm not good at recording names out of the blue, and I haven't seen people for 15 or 20 years or whatever. Carlo Valmorda, the Valmorda family in Melbourne. I did and the people involved in the Italian earthquake appeals, some of whom I'd known earlier, would have had an influence.
What about the business leaders who are of an ethnic background, the Palos from the Jewish community?
The labellers.
Oh, well, Leslie Liebler is always influential in particular, more particularly on Jewish causes. Avi Parbo was an advisor to my government on a number of issues. Never had any official position, but he was a person whose advice was always useful and welcome.
Some examples there?
I used to consult with people about general economic policy and the direction we were going and what people thought the government ought to do. You get some interesting consequences from that. I mean, Avi Parbo was often part of that group. But in the 1982 budget, at a dinner at the Lodge where a number of people were present, and said, what's the maximum deficit that we should have? Not more than $2 billion. We bring the deficit in significantly under $2 billion. Within a year, half the people who were at that dinner had forgotten the advice they had then given and had publicly said, John Elliott was at the forefront of these, that the deficit in the 1982 budget was outrageously large. It's when you get too close to people. Avi Parbo is not one of those, by the way. He'd remember what he'd said on the earlier occasion. But there's no doubt that ethnic leaders from a wide variety of groups are playing an increasing role in Australian life and advising government on the broadest issues. I mean, one of the, I think, signs of success of the thing, I would have sought Avi Power's advice over a whole range of issues over a number of years. I was just seeking the advice of an Australian, which I think is as it ought to be. I wasn't regarding myself as seeking the advice of somebody from an ethnic community. And there would have been other people in that category. And I think that's the way really it ought to be. They're just there because they're doing a great job. And you go to them for advice if they are.